The committee will come to order. We had been in recess with 4 votes on the floor. It is the intention of the chair to bring up this bill. Any recorded votes may be rolled till after the next bill as well. And then we should have voting as we continue on with the markup. There are several things that still need to be addressed in this markup, and we do have votes later tonight. So, with that, coming back, I believe we had left it. We were going to recognize the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia for her 5 minutes. Ms. Norton, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm resuming on my own time at this point. The budget autonomy law is the law of the land. It really is interesting to note that the Federal Court of Appeals had this matter before it and simply refused to take it up, but gave it not to any federal court, but sent it to our own local court, the Superior Court of the District of Columbia. Didn't say why, but I can't help but find significance in what is a very unusual remand. So that as we speak, the only court ruling in effect is the ruling that has upheld the Budget Autonomy Act of 2013 and ordered the District of Columbia government to implement it, its local officials. So I find it close to laughable that my Republican friends have threatened jail for D.C. officials who implement what the court told them to do. The second time that this Congress has tried to bully D.C. officials with the threat of jail. The first time, of course, was on the budget autonomy, the budget legalization initiative, where we found that the language, in fact, allowed the district to go forward. Today, I will indeed shortly offer an amendment to the bill to grant the district budget autonomy, and essentially challenging this committee to continue the work of the last 2 Republican chairs, Chairman Tom Davis and Chairman Darrell Issa, who I must say I appreciate put considerable energy into trying to get budget autonomy passed for the District of Columbia. This, of course, is a quintessential American principle, but it is more identified with my Republican colleagues, local control of local budgets. Quintessentially Republican, although bipartisan in every sense of the word, because from the very beginning, that's what it meant to be an American. Mr. Davis has noted, and I quote him, "The benefits of budget autonomy for the District of Columbia are numerous, real, and much needed. There is no drawback." The position of the Republican witnesses just 5 days ago who took a position on budget autonomy all favored it, even though the Republican witnesses differed with legal interpretation. Control over the dollars raised by local taxpayers is, of course, the most central element of local control. It's central to the American notion of government, and it is probably the most cited principle of my Republican colleagues. Budget autonomy also has enormous budget benefits, some of which it seems to me my Republican colleagues would be the first to stand up and support. For example, lowering budget costs, and there are a whole panoply of others. And of course, for Congress, it means no longer wasting your time by getting the D.C. budget, which they never amend. And if they want to do something by adding something to it, they have the option of doing that even without our budget being here. Because the Congress, we lose everything without budget economy. But the Congress loses nothing. This is not statehood. Under the Constitution, Congress will still have the authority to legislate on district matters, including the local budget, even Under the Budget Autonomy Act, the federal financial mandates of the district remain in place, including all that has been mandated, barring cap, the chief financial officer, and all that goes with that. The Republican budget, which was issued earlier this year, made a very principled case for local control. I won't cite all of their language, but it is very interesting to note that in releasing their own budget, the Republican majority cited the unique needs and challenges of local communities, and then ended by saying we are humble enough to admit that the federal government does not have all the answers. I ask the committee today to exercise a little of that humility now for local control for the local budget of the District of Columbia. And I yield back and I thank the chairman.
I thank the gentlewoman. If any other member wishes to speak on the bill, I believe the gentlewoman has an amendment to the bill.
I do have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5233, offered by Ms. Norton of the District of Columbia. Strike sections 2 and 3 and insert the following.
The gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton, is recognized for 5 minutes to explain the amendment. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read.
Very simple amendment. It actually will put members on record as to whether or not they oppose the procedure that the District of Columbia used to arrive at budget autonomy, or whether they simply oppose local control of local budgets, in this case for the District of Columbia. Because my amendment makes the text of the local budget autonomy federal law, in keeping with what we understand to be Republican principles about local budgets and who ought to control them. In short, Congress would, under my amendment, grant the district budget autonomy. It puts the amendment on, puts the committee on record as agreeing with, for example, President George W. Bush, who supported budget autonomy, in tandem also with the Republican-controlled Senate, which in 2003 actually passed budget autonomy by unanimous consent. And it would put this committee in agreement with the committee's last two Republican chairmen, Tom Davis and Darrell Issa, of course, whom, as I indicated earlier, both sought budget autonomy. I think they did it as a matter of principle, but they also understood the benefits to the Congress and to the District of Columbia. The majority's own witnesses have acknowledged that budget autonomy is a policy they support, including improved financial operations. What would Congress give up? You would think if this is a matter of such urgency, Congress would lose something. In fact, they lose nothing under a mandated budget autonomy bill that is the subject of my amendment. The local portion of the D.C. budget would continue to be transmitted to Congress for a 30-day legislative layover period, just like all other D.C. legislation. During that period, Congress can use any number of expedited procedures to approve or disapprove the local budget, just as they can do right now. Now, the committee has shown a willingness, even recently, to use the disapproval resolutions on D.C. legislation. The chairman himself has introduced 2 disapproval resolutions. Just last year, the committee and the House approved a disapproval resolution on a D.C. bill. Beyond the disapproval process, Congress has the constitutional authority to pass any bill at any time for the district, including enacting, amending, or repealing the entire Home Rule Act itself or any portion of it. My Republican colleagues are fond of calling themselves constitutionalists. Well, in the Federalist Paper 43, James Madison discussed the governance of the nation's capital in particular and said that, and here I am quoting Madison, a municipal legislature for local purposes derived from their own suffrage will, of course, be allowed to them is us, the District of Columbia, the people who reside in this city. Mr. Chairman, on my amendment, members will take a position on whether they support local control of local affairs, especially budgetary affairs, or whether they disagree with Madison and believe that the federal government knows best how to govern the municipal affairs of the almost 700,000 American citizens who live in your nation's capital. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank the gentlewoman. Now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to the gentlewoman's amendment in that the very nature of the amendment is to undermine what Congress's intent was, and more specifically, the intent of our founding fathers. I find it curious that the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia would cite the Federalist 43 and specifically James Madison, because in reading his entire argument, he called for the complete authority of Congress over the seat of government, a, quote, indispensable necessity, close quote. And so to suggest that James Madison and our founding fathers had any other intent other than what has been clearly articulated not only in the arguments in the hearing, but today would not be representative of the entire argument. That being said, I think it's very important that we note that in 1973, when the Home Rule Act was indeed enacted into law, there were several compromises, and the gentlewoman wants to talk about what the Senate has done and what other bodies have done, but ultimately, for it to be enacted into law, there had to be a compromise. That compromise was to keep the complete appropriations authority over the district, and it's spelled out in the Home Rule law. To look at that and to interpret it any other way would be not only to ignore the congressional record, but it would also to ignore the fundamental way that we amend the Home Rule Act. Sections 601, 602, and 603 were very clear, Mr. Chairman, in terms of how that they were unamendable. When you read those provisions, it is also clear that it retains the appropriation authority for Congress and upholds the intent, the congressional intent as it was originally passed. I will close with this, that a vote in favor of the gentlewoman's amendment is not anything that would indicate the merits of budget autonomy and whether it should or should not happen. It really flies in the face of what our founding fathers and the Constitution has outlined and has served this body well. The gentlewoman's own words says that we have allowed great flexibility with regards to the District of Columbia and their budget, saying almost never changing their budget. And yet, for it to be something that the district sees as a burdensome requirement really contradicts that argument. So I would yield back. I would encourage my colleagues to vote against the gentlewoman's amendment.
Thank the gentleman. Does any other member wish to be? The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, the ranking member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I strongly support the amendment which would ensure that the District of Columbia has greater control of its own locally raised tax dollars. I mean, when you ride around the District of Columbia and see what is going on here, the many families, the millennials, and so many people moving in, every time I say to myself, you know, folks should have 2 senators and the Congress folks and everything else that every state has. And the idea that one cannot even control the tax dollars that they raise, I think is very, very unfortunate. And it actually, in a lot of ways, it flies in the face of what democracy is all about. I do not believe there is a member of this committee that would stand for the federal government dictating the local budget of a city in his or her district, and D.C. should not be treated any differently. As I noted in my opening statement, the majority of his own witnesses supported D.C. budget autonomy in a hearing held last week. Granting D.C. local budget autonomy is not only the right thing to do, it would also have significant financial benefits for the district, such as lowering borrowing costs. It would also mean an end to the threat of a cutoff of D.C. municipal services in the event of a federal government shutdown. And so I urge the members to support the amendment, and I yield to the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, because I'd like to respond to Mr. Meadows. What I quoted from Madison was not inconsistent with final authority of the Congress of the United States. And remember, what we're talking about is the budget would come here for 30 days. What Madison said was a municipal legislature for local purposes derived from their own suffrages will, of course, be allowed them. He didn't say that Congress could not, in its constitutional power, overrule them, and I have conceded that that would happen. Moreover, my amendment now would ask you, Mr. Meadows, and the members of Congress not to approve the budget autonomy resolution, but to yourselves give, by statute, budget autonomy to the District of Columbia, which is what Madison indeed envisioned, that any change would have to come through the Congress, and I am asking you to make that change, not through the budget autonomy resolution, but using your own principles, your principles of local control and local autonomy. Use those principles on your own lights to approve a federal budget autonomy bill vote for the District of Columbia.
Will the gentlewoman yield? Oh, will the gentleman yield?
Yield.
Thank you. Thank the gentleman for yielding. The gentlewoman knows sincerely that I have been willing to work with her on a number of issues as it relates to D.C. government, having had personal meetings with members of the City Council on this very issue. And you have my commitment to continue to work as long as it doesn't undermine the constitutional authority of this esteemed body. And in doing that, I reaffirm that commitment to work in a bipartisan way to not only support the constitutional authority of this body, but understanding some of the difficulties that the district may have, and I'll yield back. I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Thank you. This way I won't take 5 minutes, Mr. Chairman. You know, first of all, I believe my friend from North Carolina is sincere, and I know he is, and I know that he wants to be helpful. I can't agree with him on his reading on the Constitution. You know, the Constitution was written before the existence of the District of Columbia. And I cannot believe that the founders envisioned a modern urban metropolis that Congress would interfere with at its whim. So yeah, we're all for self-determination and autonomy unless it involves marijuana, or unless it involves the wrong decision from one's philosophical point of view in terms of reproductive rights, or asserts budget autonomy, including with the district's own money in terms of revenues raised locally. The fact constitutionally we have the right doesn't mean we should exercise it in this fashion. It's intrusive, it's patronizing, It invokes a plantation mentality deeply resented by the people in this region. And as a member of Congress of this region, I can speak to that. My constituents in Virginia don't appreciate it. And it's just the wrong thing to do. I would respectfully suggest the folks in North Carolina would no more welcome this kind of congressional intrusion than do the people here in the District of Columbia, even though, yes, the Constitution allows it. And I wish our colleagues on both sides of the aisle could understand the frustration and the deep condescension members of District of Columbia feel from this body. It's not right, and it's time to free the District of Columbia. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Does any other member wish to speak? We'll recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, I do know that there are sincere motivations behind this, but it's important to note that Federalist 43, Madison talks about the complete authority needing to be over the district for the federal government, and he speaks with the context of the mutiny in Pennsylvania 5 years before in 1783, where you had the Philadelphia legislature that was national in scope, that was subject to unrest, and it was not capable of defending itself. When you look at this in a framework, this is why Madison would say the indispensable necessity of complete authority at the seat of government carries its own evidence with it. So it's fine to cite Federalist 43 and to try to make it look like we should have local control of the nation's capital, but it is the people's city. It is not the district's. It is the nation's city. It is not the residents. It belongs to we, the people of the republic. And while there are concerns locally, the fact that we would have a provision in here that states the federal portion of the annual budget shall be submitted to the president, this completely bypasses the ability of the people of the country to have a say in its national seat of government. This is a problem. It is also a problem for the security of the seat of the government. And so while I appreciate the fact that we now have members of the committee and progressives in particular reading the Federalist Papers, that is encouraging. I think we also need to be very careful as we look at its interpretation. The district belongs to we, the people. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Boyle, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as someone who is left of center and who owns a copy of the Federalist Papers, I appreciate anyone, regardless of where they are in the political spectrum, reading it and recognize the brilliance of James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton. I do just want to point out for the record that in the late 1780s, when the Constitution was being debated, and Maryland and Virginia stole the nation's capital from my hometown of Philadelphia. I had to get that in there. At that time, in the late 1780s, which was still over a decade before D.C. would ultimately become the nation's capital, the fact is that what became Washington, D.C. was farmland and a swamp. I really have a hard time believing that our nation's founders, who believed in self-determination, who believed in the principle of only taxation with representation, I have a hard time believing that they would be comfortable with a situation that has emerged in which you now have a major metropolitan city of about 700,000 people who have not entirely self-rule and no partial representation in the House and no representation in the Senate. So as we read the Federalist Papers and we talk about the Constitution, it is important to remember the historical fact that at that time, Washington, D.C. did not exist and would not come into existence for another decade. So I think it is entirely appropriate that we support full democracy here in the nation's capital. I'm a strong supporter of this amendment, and I'm happy to yield.
Would my friend yield?
unless he's going to take issue with my comment about Virginia stealing the nation's capital. But I will, since I have such confidence in him, I will yield anyway.
I thank my friend. I actually want to respond to our friend and colleague from Oklahoma. It sounds very high-minded to cite the people own D.C. But we cherry-pick here. It's not so simple, I would say to my friend. The people don't run the day-to-day government of the District of Columbia, the people he's referring to. The elected leadership of Washington, D.C. runs that government. These people you're talking about don't pay for the operating costs of Metro every day. The taxpayers of Washington, D.C. pay for that. And if we're, if we want to take over the entire management of the city government, we can be arguing zoning cases. I used to do that for a living in local government. The fact of the matter is we're cherry picking. When we don't object to something they do, we let it go. When we do, philosophically, we impose our will. And then we hide behind this constitutional cloud and even cite the Federalist Papers as if they were dispositive. And they're not. This is about raw political power being imposed on American citizens who do not have a voting voice here in the United States Congress. And that is a shame that should be addressed, and we ought not to be doing what we're about to do in this committee. I yield back to my friend from Pennsylvania.
Gentleman yields.
I'm happy to yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard on this amendment? The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Mulvaney, is now recognized.
I know it's close to beating a dead horse, but I'm sort of like Brendan. I can't pass up the opportunity to actually talk about the Federalist Papers in Congress. I think it's really cool. And one of the truly wonderful things about the founding documents is that, contrary to what my good friend mentioned, I actually think it does anticipate a lot of things that have played out. Yes, the Constitution was written when this was 10 square miles of nothing. And yes, there was no subway, and yes, we didn't have zoning. But really, if you look at the document and you read it, it anticipates almost all of that. And I'm going to read just very briefly the section. It says, to talk about what had been mentioned before, quote, to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such a district not exceeding 10 square miles as may by session of other states become the seat of government, and to exercise like authority over all places purchased, it said, other districts and so forth, the indispensable necessity of complete authority as the seat of government carries with its own evidence. It is a power exercised by every legislature, I might say of the world, by virtue of its general supremacy. Without it, not only the public authority might be insulted at its proceedings, interrupted with impunity, but a dependence of the members of the general government on the state comprehending the seat of government for protection of their duty. Okay? It goes on to say that the consideration has all the more weight as the gradual accumulation of public improvements at the stationary residence of the government. They actually anticipated a city growing up here. They knew this would happen. That is the gradual accumulation of public improvements. It's what they used to call this building and the canals. And all that. They knew this was going to happen. That said, specifically because that was going to happen, it becomes even more important because if not, it's too great a public pledge to be left in the hands of a single state and would create obstacles to the removal of the government and thus make the government dependent on the state. It even goes on to talk about the people. Okay, about we the people. It says, state will no doubt provide a compact for the rights as the inhabitants will find sufficient inducements of interest to become willing parties to the cessation. So the people who are here would figure out that it would actually be in their interest to stay here as they will have had their voice in the election of the government, which is to exercise authority over them, which is over us. That the people who are here would say, you know what, yeah, I voted for Boyle, but I'm still moving to D.C. because I think it's a pretty good deal for me, since they participate in the overall process. It's really fascinating how they do this. The passage does go on to have the words that Ms. Norton mentioned, and certain local ideas can be subordinated to a local government. Zoning, part of it, absolutely, but not entirely. I can assure you, we want to build another one of these buildings someplace, we're taking the zoning authority back. And right now, we do let the city council do that, but if we want something for the federal government, darn it, we're going to tell them where to put it. And you're going to vote for it. because that's just the way the federal district has always been run. So I very much appreciate the delegate from Washington, D.C. I recognize she's doing what her people want her to do, and I get that. But I happen to agree with my good friend from, obviously not so good a friend because I've never met her state. Is it Nebraska or Oklahoma? Yeah, they all look the same to those of us from the original 13 colonies. All the square states look the same. Square states. The square states. That it is the people's city, and that the people of South Carolina have almost as much vested here as the people who live here. So with that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Is any other member wish to speak? Gentlewoman from Michigan is now recognized for 5 minutes. Ms. Lawrence.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to be on the record that I am in total support of the amendment that's been offered by my colleague, Ms. Norton, in that continuously when we have this discussion, it's almost arrogance that we sit in communities where we have the right to enact policies, budgets, on our own community. Many of us came up through local government and had the opportunity to hold a personally elected official accountable for their votes and accountable for what happened in our communities where we pay taxes. And we say it's okay for someone else, but in our own backyard, it is not acceptable. And Mr. Chair, I would like to yield back my time to the gentle lady from Washington, D.C.
I very much appreciate my good friend for yielding me some time. Look, the recitation we heard from my friend on the other side of the aisle about complete authority has never been refuted by me or anyone on this side of the aisle. You do have complete authority. We concede that. What we're asking is for you to delegate that authority to the District of Columbia, just as you have delegated home rule to the District of Columbia. So you contradict yourself. Because 40 years ago, you delegated your, quote, complete authority to the Council of the District of Columbia. We're only asking for you to do that. Hey, shall we bow down and say once again, you have complete authority. This is not statehood, my friend. I'm asking you by congressional act now to allow us to have authority over every penny, $7 billion of it, raised in the District of Columbia by the people of the District of Columbia. What would you think if indeed I wanted to have this body exercise, and I wonder if you raise as much money as we do on our own in the District of Columbia. I've long time, Mr. Russell, since I've heard anybody give as the rationale for the Congress's authority that the United States wasn't sure it could indeed defend itself if its capital, it wasn't sure what its capital was. That is in fact the case today, long repudiated by who is really in charge of the United States of America. Finally, let me say, in addition to, hey, everybody, we're asking you to give up none of your authority. We're only asking you by law to pass us a bill saying we can, in fact, pass our law, give you 30 days to look at it, and then go along and save ourselves money from borrowing and in other ways help our city. But let me say what I deeply appreciate. Calling the District of Columbia the nation's city. The federal enclave belongs to the nation, but my friend, the District of Columbia, and there's a reason why there's a difference between the words Nation of Columbia and District of Columbia. And let me assert here, whatever is your complete authority, you have no complete authority over me, sir, because I live in the District of Columbia. I yield back the balance of whatever time I've got.
The gentlewoman from Michigan controls the time. He's asking for yield to a question.
Yeah, if the gentlelady would yield for a question.
I will yield for a question.
And I thank the gentlelady from Michigan. And the gentlelady from the district, are you suggesting then that if the district should have its authority delegated so that it can have complete authority over the revenues that it raises federally, are you suggesting that my state in Oklahoma, that every federal dollar that is raised, that Oklahoma should also have the same jurisdiction?
We're talking
That we would
only
have
about
complete
local
control over those monies
You
in my
have,
home
sir.
state?
All right, if this gentleman would yield. You have complete
Gentlewoman
authority.
from Michigan controls the time.
I yield to my colleague from D.C.
You have complete control over every dime raised locally in Nebraska. I'm asking you to give the very same to me as an American citizen, fully equal to you, sir.
Thank the gentlewoman.
I yield back my
The
turn.
gentlewoman yields back. Does any other member wish to speak on the amendment? Here.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah.
I just wish our colleague would clarify, is it Nebraska or Oklahoma?
It's one
I
of
thought
those-
it was like-
it's one of those square states.
Aren't they-
yes.
aren't they all the
Also
same?
known as a rectangle, yes. If none, the question is now on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Roll call has been requested. As previously announced, further proceedings on the question will be postponed. Are there further amendments to the bill? As previously announced, further proceedings on H.R. 5233 will be postponed. It is the intention of the chair to go through this next bill, and at that time, we will pause briefly for a recess. We can give a time a little bit certain for members to then gather and have any roll call votes that may or may not have been called up until that point. But we are going to call up H.R. 5226. We are recognizing that other committees are in session. We also have a very active debate on the floor of the House where many of our members are participating. Nevertheless, our next item for consideration is H.R. 5226, the Regulatory Integrity Act of 2016, and the clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 5226 to amend Chapter 3 of Title V United States Code to require the publication of information relating to pending agency regulatory actions and for other purposes.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize the sponsor of the bill, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Walberg, for 5 minutes to explain the legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My bipartisan legislation, H.R. 5226, the Regulatory Integrity Act, promotes transparency and accountability during the formal rulemaking process. It requires agencies to post in a central location all the public comments they issue during the proposed rule stage. The bill further prohibits agencies from actively soliciting support for what should be a neutral, open comment process, and requires agencies to tell the public whether they are considering alternatives or soliciting feedback during the proposed rule stage. Trust in government is among its all-time low, in part because of overreaching and unaccountable bureaucracies that too often push the boundaries of their authority. These same agencies issue thousands of new regulations and imposed billions of dollars in regulatory costs on the American people. Already in 2016, the administration has imposed $63 billion in new regulatory costs and proposed an additional $16 billion. Agencies are supposed to genuinely consider comments from the public and incorporate reasonable changes, but oftentimes they're just going through the motions. At worst, agencies may tilt the balance in their favor by actively campaigning for their original proposal. We saw this play out during the EPA's Waters of the U.S. rulemaking process. The EPA undertook a public campaign to solicit support for what they claimed was a proposed rule. The agency used social media to undermine the purpose and spirit of the rulemaking process by condensing a complex, costly, and controversial proposed rule down to a misleading talking point. By asking for support before the rule was finalized, it was clear that EPA had already prejudged the outcome of its rulemaking. The Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office concluded the EPA overstepped and issued a report that said the agency undertook, and I quote, covert propaganda and, quote, grassroots lobbying during the process. Those are strong words. Although the EPA is the latest example, it is certainly not alone. In our last markup, the committee reported S-1109, which addressed problems with agencies overselling settlement agreements as prosecutorial successes by providing transparency into settlements and providing reasonable requirements to how the agency communicates about the settlement. H.R. 5226 builds on that bipartisan framework to address similar problems with agencies overselling proposed regulations at a time when they ought to be listening to the public with an open mind. The rulemaking process must be transparent and accountable to ensure that the final rule is effective and well-reasoned, but also that the public believes the process was legal and fair. The Regulatory Integrity Act is needed to ensure that all federal agencies adhere to the letter and the spirit of the law by remaining neutral arbiters during the rulemaking process. This bipartisan legislation is supported by several members of this committee, as well as by the American Farm Bureau, Michigan Farm Bureau, and the NFIB. I urge all my colleagues to support this good government bipartisan bill. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Cummings, for his statement on the bill.
Mr. Chairman, I agree that more transparency is needed in the regulatory process. That is not what this bill is really about, however, and I oppose it. The bill is aimed at what its sponsors believe agencies should not disclose. Specifically, this bill would prohibit federal agencies from making any public communications that would promote a pending regulatory action. It's hard to believe that an agency could say anything about a pending rule that would not be considered promoting the rule. I think we can all agree that agencies should only propose rules that they believe will be beneficial. An agency, therefore, should be able to communicate why such a rule is beneficial. For example, in 2014, the Department of Defense proposed a rule to protect service members and their families from predatory lending practices. DOD's press release on the rule highlighted the benefits of the rule, such as, and I quote, "This proposed rule would better protect active duty service members and their families from excessive debt," end of quote. Under this bill, DOD could be blocked from providing that plain language explanation of the proposed rule. 2003, the Bush administration officials posed with a stack of papers, scissors and chainsaws to promote their efforts to, quote, "cut red tape," unquote. This public support of deregulation would surely be celebrated by the sponsors of this bill, yet the images and the statements from that press event would likely be barred under this legislation. The bill would also prohibit agencies from encouraging public support of an agency action. In 1961, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy delivered a speech at the University of Georgia where he advocated for federal government administrative policies aimed at battling racial discrimination. Attorney General Kennedy said, and I quote, "I come to you today, and I shall come to you in the years ahead to advocate reason and the rule of law," end of quote. Attorney General Kennedy's statement could have violated the restrictions of this bill if it had been in place. There's already a criminal statute in place that prevents agency employees from engaging in grassroots lobbying for a proposed rule. The Appropriations Committee also typically includes language in appropriation bills that prevents the agencies from using federal funds for, quote, "publicity or propaganda purposes," end of quote. This bill also includes a number of unnecessarily burdensome requirements that seem intended to reduce the amount of information agencies release to the public. Agencies would be required, for example, to list online the date, intended audience, and content of every public communication. that would make sense if it were limited to formal agency statements. The bill, however, defines public communication to include every oral, written, or electronic communication, and even documents published in the Federal Register if they do not fall within one narrow exception for rulemaking publications. Amit Narang, a regulatory policy expert with the Open Government Organization Public Citizen, told the committee staff that he is concerned that the bill, and I quote, would actually work against increased transparency. This bill is just another way to attack agency rulemaking. My colleagues are serious about improving the transparency of the regulatory process. We should work together on a bill that actually accomplishes just that. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Does any other member wish to speak on the bill? Does any, we're ready to start the amendment process if any members have an amendment to the bill. If none, the question is now on adoption and favorably reporting H.R. 5226 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported.
Roll call.
In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported, but a roll call has been requested. As previously announced, further proceedings on H.R. 5226 will be postponed. Members are informed that we are going to go into recess now until 4 o'clock. At 4 o'clock, we are going to have a vote on Ms. Norton's amendment. We will also vote on the bill that was introduced by Mr. Walberg. Then we will continue with the markup. The next bill up after that will be Mr. Massey's bill on auditing the Federal Reserve. So in order to allow time for people to come from the floor and other committees and be here for that vote, we intend to start and go back from recess promptly at 4 o'clock for that vote. Committee stands in recess until 4 o'clock.